I have here a report from the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. It's written by a Major Brian Stuckert, and he's not religious. It's not a churchy paper. It's 70 pages long, and it's an analysis of the effect on US foreign policy that general belief about Israel has on America. In other words, the American army is concerned that nearly 95% of Americans now think that Israel is where it's all going to happen. It's a very topical subject. It's more important than we think. The American military is looking at the threat that evangelical Christians have on national security by believing that Israel, the state of Israel, came into being because of prophecy. This is a very serious subject. It's now impacting on US foreign policy. We know that President Reagan believed it, that Israel came into being because of prophecy. We know that President Clinton believed it. We know that Herbert Walter Bush believed it, and his son George W. Bush believed it. It is no exaggeration to say that what Christians think about Israel impacts on the politics of the world. Have a look at some of the chapter headings in this document. I've highlighted the ones in bold that are important and crucial, and you can see, and this is not a churchy paper, this is a military document. And the chapter headings, you would think this was a religious document, yes? Israel and nuclear war, Gog and Magog and the armies from the east, and the American military saying, why should we bother negotiating peace with China and Russia and Iran? Why should we waste millions of dollars on diplomacy with these three countries if they are going to be the ultimate enemy of Israel anyway? What's the point? It's impacting on politics. So what you believe about Israel is vitally important. Many evangelical Christians believe that in May 1948, when the State of Israel came into being, when Ben-Gurion signed into existence the State of Israel, on that important day, many, in fact most, evangelical Christians believe this is a direct fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. You've met them. And they are so convinced there is not much you can say for them to change their thinking. Yep, you've met them, yep. They are obsessed with this subject because here they see a dramatic fulfillment, supposedly, of Old Testament prophecies about Israel. And most of the evangelical Christians today, 95%, if not more, believe this. Seventh-day Adventists are a minority group who do not quite see Israel this way. I can assure Major Stuckert that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not a threat to US foreign policy. The Seventh-day Adventist Church does not believe that the restoration of Israel in 1948 is a fulfillment of prophecy. The Seventh-day Adventist Church does not believe that last-day events will converge and focus in the Middle East. And we'll show you why. This is where the general belief comes from that Israel will play a role in the last days. But this particular verse, talking about the gathering in of the Jews from countries where they've been scattered and bringing them into the land of Israel, has to do with the return from Babylonian captivity. We know that. But here, this next verse stumps a lot of people. As long as there's sun and moon and stars, according to this verse, there will be Israel. How do you deal with that? How do you respond to something like this? Here it is, bulletproof, waterproof, biblical foundation for believing that the state of Israel will be restored and last forever, if you go by this verse. As long as there's sun, moon and stars, there will be Israel, says Jeremiah. How do you deal with that? Well, let's go back to the beginning of Israel. If we're going to talk about the future of Israel, we need to go back to the beginning. Here is a prototype of a Mercedes-Benz. The SV12R S-Class. I can't afford it. You probably can't afford it, and that's okay. This is not a factory production model. This is a prototype. It's as close as man can make a machine to the mass-produced factory version of this model. It's a prototype. Here is a prototype, ladies and gentlemen, of Israel. The first time Israel is mentioned in the Bible is Genesis 32. So if we're going to talk about the future of Israel, we better go back to the beginning and get our definitions right, yes? So we go to Genesis 32 and we find that Jacob, who was a con man, who was a deceiver and a supplanter, had his character changed when he met God face to face. And because his character was changed in meeting Almighty God in a private, personal, powerful moment, because his character was changed, God changed his name to Israel. And he changed from being a resistor to a clinger. There were no Jewish sacrificial services there in the background. There wasn't a sanctuary. Just one person and God. That is the definition of Israel when a person's character is changed. In a private encounter with the living God, you become Israel. From being self-obsessed to having a relationship with God. A personal reconciliation with God and with his brother, Esau. That's the definition of Israel. And hundreds of years later, when Israel as a nation descended into apostasy, Hosea the prophet appealed to this event with Jacob and said, return to God as Jacob did, because that's the essence of Israel. A character change. Not how big your nose is or whether you've got Jewish blood. It's got nothing to do with your race. It's got nothing to do with your diet. It's got nothing to do whether you can say Abraham was my grandfather. There is no mention of it. But there's mention here of character change, weeping and seeking favour from God. So you, by the help of your God, return, says Hosea. That's the essence of Israel. That's the prototype. And if we're going to talk about Israel in the last days, we need to stick with the biblical definition. Have you returned to God with weeping, seeking favour from him in a personal, private, powerful moment? Have you done this? I do it every day to the best of my ability. I reenact what Jacob did. I look at myself as a deceiver and I say I want to change from being stubborn and from being a supplanter to being a clinger. That's the essence of Israel. Let's move forward a few hundred years to the Red Sea and the Exodus. And there we read that the children of Israel left Ramses and with about 600,000 men, and a mixed multitude went up with them also. Were they Jews? Were they Hebrews? No. They were a mixed multitude. Some of them were Egyptians. Some of them were non-Hebrews who had seen the mighty miracles of God when Moses confronted Pharaoh and were convinced and said, we now believe in the Creator God. And they joined the Hebrews and fled Egypt. Yes, some of them had mixed motives. Some of them weren't truly converted. Some of them wanted to be on the winning side, yes, but some of them were genuinely converted. And they joined the Israelites, and they were not Jewish, and they moved to the foot of Mount Sinai, where they were given the law. So when people say, oh, the Ten Commandments is for Jewish people only, remember that in that congregation there were a mixed multitude of people who were not even Jewish. There were Egyptians down there. There were non-Hebrews down there when those 10 Commandments were delivered. Remember that. And the key word here is assembly. The Hebrew word for assembly does not mean denomination. It means congregation. It doesn't mean church label. Chahal, Hebrew word for assembly, means a worshipping congregation, a religious assembly. Egyptians, non-Jews, Jews, people from other lands, they're all there at the foot of Mount Sinai in a state of worship. That is the essence of Israel. And then we're told in Deuteronomy 23, don't abhor an Egyptian, don't abhor an Edomite. The children of the third generation born to these foreigners can enter the what? Can enter the assembly of the Lord. So after 3 generations, if an Egyptian man married a Hebrew woman, after 3 generations, the product of that union, that child can enter the Israelite assembly. This is so critical. We can stop right here and now and say, end the meeting. Because Israel does not mean that you've got a big nose and you have the blood of Abraham and you have olive skin. The essence of Israel is you can be a foreigner and worship the true God. And as far as the Bible is concerned, you are a member of this assembly. Do you see that? Now, the mixed multitude weren't exactly kosher. They got a bit sick of that manna, and they wanted the garlic, and they wanted the fish, and they wanted the leeks, and the onions, and the Egyptian cucumber, and the Egyptian melon. This mixed multitude were craving for the diet of their past. They were obviously not Hebrews. We laugh at this, but this is significant. They were not diet-driven like the Hebrews. They wanted the flesh pots of Egypt, remember? So Israel, friends, is a worshipping assembly. Israel means a religious community. Israel means Jews, non-Jews, Edomites, Egyptians. Not the blood of Abraham, but the faith of Abraham. Yeah? The faith of Abraham. If you've got the faith of Abraham and you're not Jewish, you're an Israelite. Maybe you're Jewish, but you don't have any faith. You're not an Israelite. This is the Bible definition of Israel. Nothing to do with bloodlines. Nothing to do with ethnicity. And then we come later on into the book of Isaiah, and we learn that even foreigners and eunuchs, you may recall eunuchs were not allowed into the assembly under Moses. If a man was mutilated in his private parts, he could not enter the assembly. But by the time we get to Isaiah, if a eunuch was a Sabbath-keeping believer, he could enter the assembly. Isn't it amazing? We started with Jacob, and then we move forward to Sinai, and the picture broadens, and now we're into the time of Isaiah, and the picture is even broader again, and that people who previously had been excluded from the assembly could now join because they were Sabbath keepers. Why? Because by being a Sabbath keeper, they're saying we believe in the Creator God. We turn our backs on idols and false worship. We believe in the Creator God. That's why.